I was watching a thing, and I forget if it was Fox or it was CNN or it was some failed state news network. And they were having the roundtable discussion. This is the most breathtakingly vapid shit. And in it, and they got to one point where they were talking about they were talking about something about the election and the re-election and all. Ooh, who's gonna vote for? What's Pennsylvania gonna do? Blah, blah, blah. But they were talking about Hispanics and how the Hispanics had a 73% approval rating for Obama. And Obama's overall approval rating is 49%. And I know among blacks it's between 85 and 90%. So what does that make his approval rating among European Americans? It's maybe like 37, 38. I didn't do the math. Maybe I should have done the math. But it's it has to be pretty low in order to offset those extremely high approval ratings amongst the other races. And I contrasted that with another thing I know of, and that is the support by race for quote unquote affirmative action. And in affirmative action, we need to start talking about affirmative action in terms of what it really is. It is legalized race-based privileges for the non-European races against racism. Against Europeans. It is racism against Europeans. And you could say that, well, what is it? Is it for Africans? Is it African nationalism? Well, not really. Is it Amerindian nationalism? Is it for? No, not really, because it also benefits Africans. No, but what it seems to be is it's just a legalized devaluation of European accomplishments, right? So you have that. And you have the racial disparity in support for that, right? And of course, and it makes sense, right? If we take a look at American politics, we can look at it as groups of self-identified races voting for that which benefits them. And this model is so much simpler. It's so much simpler than all of the complicated historical kind of things. I mean, and people will justify whatever they believe with all that. They'll justify what they believe with history or economic theory or get all tied in knots in philosophical notions of what is justice. Right, and but that's all just the canvassing. Underlying that is something much more simple. It's race conflict. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's outright race war, which involves killing to extermination the other races, but it is race conflict. It is my tribe versus your tribe, right? My people versus your people, right? And that makes sense, right? Samuel L. Jackson said it quite clearly, right? He said the reason I voted for Obama was because he's black. It wasn't for any of his policies or his ideas or anything. What it comes down to is that he's black, I'm black, he's one of mine, and so I'm going to support him. That's what this is about, right? He's one of mine, one of my people, right? And so you see among African Americans, you see the Black Caucus, you see the United New College Fund, Association of Black Lawyers, Association of Black Dentists, Association of Black Everything, right? You have racial identification in all across the African American community, and they identify and openly advocate their racial interests and their racial solidarity. Okay. And you can say, well, that racial solidarity was created in the context of oppression. And you could say that, but the thing is, you see identical things in Canada, in Britain, I believe all across Europe. You see the same kind of racial solidarity among African Americans and the same kind of outcry against oppression and discrimination. For example, in Finland, an African immigrant gets more welfare benefits than that of a native Finn who is out of work, right? Because supposedly he is oppressed by the horrible racism in Finland, right? The Finnish racism, the state that chose to bring them in, right? Is just so full of racists that the African can't find a job, and so the African is more deserving of unemployment benefits than the native Finn, who is probably just a louse. Even though there's certainly also racial privilege, black African racial privilege in Finland as well, what they call affirmative action. So that's ultimately what this is, and everything about that. And for example, white privilege. I mean, white privilege can be so simplistically debunked in that firms aren't capitalizing on white privilege. For example, if it is true that firms are undervaluing black labor, and that is the result of the systematic income gap between African Americans and European Americans, then there is great money to be made in firms that disproportionately hire these supposedly disadvantaged groups. Right? There would be, and of course, I know, each individual firm is crazy, and there's lots of variation with any individual firm. But systematically, if you had 1,000 firms, you had kind of a portfolio, a fund that invested in these things, you would expect there to be a great return on investment for these things if, in fact, the economy, employers are systematically undervaluing African American labor and Hispanic Amerindian labor. If they are, in fact, being systematically undervalued, that is a great profit opportunity. Right? And the fact that none of these people, none of these organizations that believe or perpetuate the myth of white privilege, right, which is a very nebulous thing. It's talking about, well, the GI Bill, they got a house, they went to college, colleges were only for white people for a certain period of time. And, they say all these things that are true, they're true facts, but they never draw any connection, right? They never say, okay, and that causes the current extant income gaps today, right? They never make that leap. They just say, well, look at the past and how whites had it better. Right. See, and they don't draw the connection, right? And moreover, the way we test it today is that no one's trying to capitalize off of white privilege, and that's how we know it's probably a bunch of bullshit, and that it's probably just something. It's unfalsifiable, is what it is, right? It's unfalsifiable, and it serves a political agenda. So that is ultimately what politics is in the United States, and you see it in terms of in that rich blacks, rich African Americans, vote for Democrats. Okay? They vote for Democrats. And the reason they vote for Democrats is not because it benefits them financially. It's not because it's beneficial for their personal self-interest or anything like that. It was quite the opposite. They vote for Democrats because they know that Democrats will take resources away from the other group, the European Americans, and give it to their group, the African Americans. Right? That's what this is about. That is the simplest explanation for these voting trends. Right? And so because it is the simplest explanation, and it's the one that can explain most of what we see, that's what we should go with. All these more complicated explanations, we should dismiss because they're more complicated and they don't explain what we see nearly as elegantly. It's people identifying based on race, voting based on their race. And the people who vote based on their race the least are European Americans. Even the European American Republicans, when they vote for freedom, and by freedom I mean freedom, I don't mean free stuff. When they vote for freedom, they're voting for freedom not on racial grounds, not on free markets disproportionately, or it is perceived that free markets benefit European Americans and hurt African Americans. I don't believe that's true, but that is the perception. Okay. They vote for freedom on principled grounds. On principled grounds that I support freedom because freedom is moral, and because it leads to good economic outcomes across the board, right? That is why European Americans will support freedom. And they won't say like Africans will. Like Africans will say, I support the Democrat Party because it is best for my people. They say that I vote for the Republican Party because it is best for America across the board. Economic freedom is best for America across the board, right? So even the Europeans who inadvertently vote in their racial interest, they're doing so for non-racial reasons. Right? Which brings us to the next point, and that is that Europeans are far and away the least racist race on the planet. No other race has this third of its own population, and no other race on the planet institutes racist laws against themselves, and institutes a system of racial privilege that goes against its own. This is unprecedented in world history. Say what you want about, Europeans having, segregation or not allowing blacks in colleges. I mean, that's par for the course in world history, right? That's what people do or did in world history up until the European age, up until the Europeans spreading the Enlightenment ideas around the world, being the light of the world. Up to that point, that was normal, right? When you conquered another tribe, you enslaved them, you took their women as breeding stock. Okay, it was more than just not being allowed to come to our colleges. No, it was we kill the men and take the women. Right? That was the world. Okay, that was the world, and you have all these various coalitions moving around in order to advance their own power. But that was the world before the European conquests. So, and when the Europeans conquered the world, what did the Europeans bring? Well, the Europeans brought with them liberal ideas. And the idea of individual rights and the moral rights of the individual, say that they came from God, whether or not you believe in God is not, that who cares. Idea of property rights, that is you own land, and just the ideas of a general rights of man, and this kind of liberal, in a classical sense, I don't mean in the U.S. Democratic Party sense, but this classical kind of liberal ideas that pulled the world out of this pit, this cesspool of just endless raping, just endless barbarism, and just endless, and just feralness of animal kingdom kind of thing. It was the European conquests that attempted to bring, for example, Africa out of this, and was only partially successful in doing so. Right? It was the European conquest that did this. Okay? And it is Europeans, the only race on the planet that in any significant numbers adopts people of other races. No one else does this. I don't see black families adopting, a bunch of poor white kids from Eastern Europe. You don't see that. Right? It's white people who do this. It is white people who are racially altruistic. It is white people who instituted racial privilege laws against themselves. Okay? It is white people who voted to eliminate slavery in Brazil, I believe, and supported the ending of slavery in the United States. Didn't quite vote for it, but indirectly, the support for slavery wasn't high enough that when Lincoln abolished it, it went away. And of course, it remained in several states for quite a long time until it was voted away. And for example, New Jersey, which a lot of people don't know, had slavery past 1865. I don't remember precisely when it ended, but you had those border states in the Union which still had slavery for a little while until it was actually voted away. Or another example of this would be apartheid in South Africa, right? For example, the British entered South Africa, what is modern day South Africa, and the area was mostly empty. There were a few Bushmen and Bantus and Kojans, but for the most part, it was an empty area. And the vast majority of the African population was far north in what is modern day Zimbabwe and Mozambique and Botswana. That's where the population centers were. Great Zimbabwe was in Zimbabwe, modern day Zimbabwe. Okay, and so that's where the population was. But it was when the British started building up industry in South Africa, building mines and industrial scale agriculture in South Africa, that is when you had mass migration of Africans from the north. And these mass migration of Africans from the north made a huge trek. I mean, if you put the United States on the map of Africa, I mean, this trek was like the equivalent of going from the tip of Michigan down to Louisiana. It was a huge distance. And there were no real roads to speak of. It was a huge migration. And they made these gigantic migrations to come down to apartheid South Africa for the better life that they would get as a second-class citizen in a white-run country than they would as a first-class citizen in a black-run, quote-unquote, country. The various, if you could call the domain of the Zulu, if you could even call that a country. Of course, the life expectancy within South Africa for the Africans just exploded. The standard of living, of course, exploded, and their population, as a result, exploded. And this is directly attributable to the British industrialization of the region. And then, following this, you had the Europeans in South Africa, of traditionally British and some Dutch descent, voting the system away, saying, you know what? It's not right. It's not right that us whites should have all the power. It's your country too. We should share power. It's not right that we're doing this, right? In an unprecedented, in an ahistorical outburst of racial altruism, the whites gave the blacks the keys. And the result has just been a disaster. The result has been decolonization, has been the destruction of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. The actual decline, I mean, there's been actually a net decline across all of Africa in life expectancy, a net decline in standard of living per capita across all of Africa. I think the economy, I believe since from colonialism, from decolonization to 1990, the total economy actually shrank in size despite like a doubling in population. I think the economy of Africa across the board has actually started to go up a little bit, but in per capita it's still dropping. It's dropping down to pre-European levels is one way to say it. You can also look at slavery, right? The Atlantic slave trade. Oh, how terrible, right? Europeans were enslaving all these people. Well, it's par for the course in world history. Oh, I mean, I hear these people who talk about slavery and the brutality of slavery. It's like how, in all of the atlases that you've read, all of the historical atlases that you've read, where, I mean, it's everywhere. Slavery is everywhere. Massacres are everywhere. This is history. This is the history of humanity. This is humanity once the veil of civilization is pulled down. This is man. Okay, but anyway, but aside from that, the European slavery was unprecedented in that it had laws on how you're supposed to treat the slaves. You know, you had laws about how, and you had banks that would insure slaves as property, but they would also have, in order to get your slaves insured, you had to treat them a certain way. And this was a way to have a measure of humanity toward them. Okay, and even during the initial stages of the American Revolution, there were debates about slavery. Now, nothing came of it as it happened, but this is something unprecedented. You had people saying, no, it's wrong that these people are enslaved. Not everyone was saying that. There's still plenty of Europeans who held the old pre-Enlightenment, pre-civilization view. Rape, torture, kill, and fuck. But Europeans were starting to pull away from that. And as the Europeans were pulling away from that, they were pulling the rest of the world with them. The Europeans were the beacon of the world who pulled the world up with them. Okay, we compare this to the Arab slave trade. And of course, what people don't know is that more slaves were actually sent to the Arab world in the Middle East than to the Americas. Yeah, so we have to ask the question, well, where is the vibrant African Afro-Arab culture? Where is it? Where are the Detroits? Where are the Baltimores? Where are the downtown New Orleanses? Where are the inner cities, the inner city slums? Where is the vibrant African culture? Where is Londonistan? Not Londonistan, that's Arabs going into an area. But where are these things? Where is the Arab? Well, of course, it doesn't exist. Because the Arabs castrated the males and worked them to death whenever they could. They brought over shipments of males from Africa and castrated them and worked them to death. And the women were kept as wet nurses for their own children, right? And not allowed to breed. That's what they did. Now, so who is hated for slavery as a result? Are the Arabs hated for slavery? They brought in more. And they didn't allow them to live. They worked them to death. That's why there are no heirs. There are no descendants. Who's hated more for slavery? The Africans or the Europeans? The Europeans who did not work them to death, who had laws as to how they were to be treated. I think there are some islands in the Caribbean where they were worked to death by the French. But generally speaking, in the two principal states, Brazil and the United States, they were not worked to death. Okay, so but Europeans are to be ashamed, right? And really, Europeans are to be ashamed because in that transition period between the pre-Enlightenment, the pre-industrial mindset of my tribe versus your tribe, rape, torture, kill and fuck, animal world, in that transition period, which the Europeans themselves ushered, right? It was Britain, and it was the British Empire that enforced the global ban on slavery. Right? It was the British and French empires that imposed British and French law and a consistency of law across Africa, across the mostly empty, hunter-gatherer / subsistence farming lifestyles of Africa, right? And people say there's great civilization. I mean, there were a few. There were scarce few. There was Zimbabwe, which was not very big. All right, they were not very big. They were dispersed geographically, like the Kingdom of Mali and there's Ghana. But there's another one. I know there's this great Kingdom of Mali. There are a bunch of them, but they're in that general same area, just north of the Ivory and Gold Coast. All right, but the thing is, Africa was conquered with the rejects of Europe, with the nothings of Europe, and of course Africans. I mean, they had trade access to the East. They had trade access to gunpowder. Okay, I mean, and so some people are saying, well, they didn't have gunpowder. Well, why didn't they have gunpowder? I mean, it wasn't that. I mean, the Arabs had gunpowder, and they were just a boat wasn't So I mean, it wasn't that far away, And of course, it was. I mean, Europeans had gunpowder for like 500 years before they started conquering Africa. And they conquered Africa. I mean, there were a few battles against the Zulus in the south of Africa, but generally, the quote unquote conquest didn't really consist of much at all. In fact, most of Africa remained untouched by European rule for forever. I mean, for like to this day, like you have these states that kind of came into existence. Well, this was what Belgium owned. This is what Portugal owned. Now it's Angola. But of course, it's not a real state. It's like, it's just the area that Portugal had and is now being carved off as its own state, when really it was just like, it was artificial from the beginning and it's artificial now. And of course, that's part of why you have a lot of ethnic conflict in Africa. Anyway, I'm going off on kind of a lot of tangents here. Anyway, the point is that Europeans have nothing to be ashamed of. All right? Moreover, Africa, when the Europeans quote unquote conquered it, Africa was mostly empty. Okay, and to say that Africans owned the entire continent at this time, this mostly empty continent, I mean the entire continent of Africa at the time of by around like 1600, all of Africa south of the Sahara had about 80 million people. 80 million people spread out over an area it's like 4 times the size of the United States. Probably more than that. It's over a huge area. It was empty. It was an empty continent. It was called the Dark Continent, not because, well, maybe it's partly because the people had dark skin, but also because it was empty. Right? And so when Europeans went out there, it was practically wilderness. I mean, Europe, a much smaller area, had about 200 million people at the time. And there were areas in Europe at the time that were called wilderness. There were areas in northern Scandinavia. There were areas, in Russia that were called wilderness, despite being far more densely populated than Africa overall. Okay, Africa was wilderness. And so when Europeans claimed it, it wasn't like they were going into this well-developed, well-built-up area and like, conquering tribes and civilizations like the Spanish did in America, quite frankly. But even then, most of America was also kind of like that. I mean, Brazil was not too populated. I mean, the only real states were the Aztecs and Incas, and arguably a few small states in the American Southwest. But generally, you have to ask the question. I mean, a black person in the United States, does he wish that slavery never happened so that he could be happy-go-lucky in Africa? Does he wish that? I mean, if you're a black person in the U.S., do you wish slavery never happened? Like, really? Okay. And you may say, well, no, I don't wish slavery never happened. And because of that, and I understand like the historical flow of things, and I'm willing to put that aside, but I'm not willing to put Jim Crow aside. That needs to stay back. Well, one thing to consider in regards to Jim Crow is that the vast majority of Africans in the United States, I think even to this day, were in the South. They were born in the South. They were brought in as slaves. They got freed, kind of wandered all over the place, and that's where they stayed. They stayed in the South. So I have all these Africans in the South. And in the South, you have race laws. You have segregation laws, segregated schools, segregated neighborhoods, segregated police, segregated everything. Everything's segregated. And what's funny is that a lot of people don't realize that even in this horrible segregated society, there was still a very slight wealth transfer from the Europeans in that area to the Africans in that area. Right? Even under Jim Crow, there was still a net wealth transfer from white to black. So you had segregation, right? And in this segregation, it was so bad that the overwhelming majority of Africans chose to stay in the South. That's how bad it was. It was so bad that the inconvenience of moving was greater than how bad it was greater than how bad the Jim Crow laws were. All right? Now, a lot of people say, well, the reason they didn't move is because they were poor. Yeah, no. Under slavery, they had to have slave patrols to keep the Africans in the South. The Africans got their belongings and traveled north, the North Star, the Little Dipper, or whatever, followed the drinking gourd or whatever. They came out, they saw the stars, and they figured out which way to go and stay that way and go north to quote-unquote freedom. You have to get pretty far, they have to get up to Canada. Anyway, but they were willing to do that. You had a bunch of blacks willing to do that, right? They were willing to, and what did they have? They had the clothes on their back and maybe a satchel of corn pone or something. And they're willing to do that to go up to the north. That's because slavery was really bad. And in fact, in order to maintain slavery, they had to conscript whites in the South to form slave patrols. Right? They had to have conscription to keep them on the slave plantations. So slavery which was actually bad, actual oppression, they had to use, they didn't build a giant wall, but they had to use force to keep them in. You look at the Soviet Union, not only did they build the Berlin Wall and a wall around the outside of West Berlin, But they also had to build not as impressive, but a much longer wall down the entire continent of Eastern Europe, called the Iron Curtain. Okay, they had to do that in order to keep people in. North Korea has to build a big old wall across their border with South Korea in order to keep people in, right? Actual oppressive regimes have to build walls or do something to keep people in. Now, did the Jim Crow South do anything to keep blacks in? like if anything, they would have helped them pack. Like, oh, you want to get out of here? Let me help you. Here, I got some guys in a moving van. Hey, some niggers want to get out of our neighborhood. They want to get out of our land. Yes, let's help them move, right? That's how oppressive it was. That despite all this, blacks chose to stay. See? And that alone tells me that this whole Jim Crow thing is a farce. And of course, and on top of that, we can also look at all the predictions. Oh, we're going to end segregation. And you know what's funny is that there was the income gap was narrowing in the United States, and between blacks and whites. And it was narrowing in the South, and it was narrowing in the Northeast and the rest of the country. Now, in 1965, you had the Second Civil Rights Act. The 1964 one, I think, was where segregation was no longer forced. That is, firms were no longer forced to segregate. The bus lines were no longer forced to segregate. And that's another thing to keep in mind, is that the bus lines, they were just following the law, right? They had to send blacks in the back. They weren't forced to, but they had to. Okay, so anyway, where was I going with this? Oh, income. So you had the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Now, what region of the United States would the Civil Rights Act impact the most? What region of the United States had the most segregation? Well, this is not a trick question. It would be the former Confederate States, the former CSA. Okay. This area was impacted, we would expect to be impacted by the Civil Rights Act the most. Now, what's interesting is that the income gap was narrowing between blacks and whites from about 1955 to about 1972, where it flatlined across the country. And this is like a countrywide thing. It basically went from 1955 to 1972. There was a massive narrowing of the income gap, and then 1972, bam, flatlined. Okay? And what's interesting is that after 1965, after the passage of civil rights, the income gap between blacks and whites continued to narrow, right? It was narrowing from 1955 to 1972, right? But it narrowed more outside of the former Confederate States, okay? So the idea that the passage of civil rights had anything to do with this narrowing income gap, the evidence does not back that up. Okay. And moreover, what did segregation do? What did segregation do? Well, it meant that if you wanted to live in a neighborhood, it would be an all-black neighborhood. And in order to be in walking distance to any shop, that shop would have to be owned by a black person, meaning that black people had to own their own businesses. Okay, whereas today it's all integrated. Well, you can have all the white people own businesses because white people are better at owning businesses, and we can argue as to why that is. Well, it's because they have more money, they have more family connections, blah 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 blah. Or you can say it's genetic. Ooh, can't say that. But for whatever reason, we'll just skip why for now. But for whatever reason, whites are better at owning businesses and running businesses. Okay. And so what happens in an integrated society is that you don't get any black business owners, or at least not many, and the ones, or unless you have some sort of program, right, some sort of race privilege program to do it. Whereas in a segregated society, you had to have black doctors, and more segregated, you have to have them, right? Because there are no whites going to doctor. You have to have black doctors, you have to have black business owners, you have to have black mechanics, right? And so as a result, the employment rate among blacks during the Jim Crow South was higher than that among whites. Yes, whites were more unemployed than blacks were. Okay, and the black family structure was stable. Okay, you didn't see this out of wedlock births or anything. And so this kind of idea that it is kind of like the default state of blacks to just be savages or things like that, I don't think it's true. I think blacks are innately a bit more violent. I think it has to do with the MAOA gene and not being able to downregulate serotonin, so they snap more often. They'll go from zero to fire and hate in their eyes and nothing. You disrespected them, bam, right at you. And I think that has to do with a low repeat MAOA gene. And some other genes as well. But generally, like we know, like people are looking at, well, how on earth can we rebuild the black family community, the black family structure? And it was built. Okay, it did exist. in the Jim Crow South. That's where it existed. Right? It's where it's when you had these ideas of racial integrationism, and you had these ideas of feminism and females in the workplace, right? And you had hyper-regulation of the economy where it became difficult, where now it's, I mean, for example, let's say you want to start an ice cream store today. You want to start an ice cream store. Do you even know where to start? Do you know what bureaus to go to find out what forms to get? Like how do you, like, if you're going to start a business, where do you even begin nowadays? Like, you can't just start a business. Practically speaking, you got to know someone if you want to get it done in any humane time frame. Okay? And so that the inability to start a business, okay, the glorification of women in the workplace, and you know, women are fine and all that stuff, but when you break down the family structure, you break down the family structure, okay? And we're looking at a lot of problems here. You have the rise of feminism. I need to explain that. When women are women value men not particularly based on looks, but based on their perceived power and their ability to provide. If women are earning as much as men, and when they don't need men to provide for them, men suddenly become not very attractive to them, okay? And when men become not particularly attractive to women, women hate the men. And this is what everyone used to know, which is that women dislike bitch men, or beta males, or whatever you want to call them. Women dislike them. They despise them. Guys who treat women like children almost, and, you know, are kind of forward with them, and yeah, treat them like children, except children that they have sex with. Ooh, pedophilia. You know, that comes, and so a lot of feminists say all males are pedophiles. Well, there's a half truth to that. But anyway, treating women like children, treating them like small mammals, and kind of manipulating their body around, you know, and all that. I mean, all good sex is basically a form of domination of one way or another, of consented domination of one way or another. You know, that's what women are attracted to. And if you can't provide, if you don't have any economic worth, then a woman's not going to be attracted to you. Okay, a woman is attracted to your wallet. They're attracted to your ability to provide resources for the kids, right? That's the evolutionary thing. Now, they may not know particularly why they are sexually attracted to men with money. All right, it's not exactly a gold digger thing, but it's a biological thing. I mean, and evolutionarily, we know that it is because, you know, the wealthier men have the more stuff that they can use to take care of the kids, and so the women jump his bones, you know, get pregnant, and they can be rather certain that the kids will have enough food to survive. That's what it is. And when women are no longer attracted to men based on their wealth, they're no longer attracted to men. They start to dislike men. They start to divorce more often. Right? They start to have, you start to have single mothers. And in fact, nowadays it's happening so much. You have this glorification of single mothers, and you also have lower reproductive rates. You have more violent kids, right? Because they don't have a stable family structure throughout their life. It's all over the place. Okay. Yeah. You have women just go insane. Men become bitched. Men become completely. They start to worship women. They start to put women on a pedestal, and that causes women to like men even less. And then you get to a point where we're at today, where men, the very few men who don't put women on a pedestal, PUAs or whatever you want to call them, who don't put women on a pedestal and treat women like children, they get all the women. It becomes that easy. The situation is so screwed up that at this point you can just kind of, you know, be a boss and you'll get women. Whereas in a healthy society, that wouldn't work. In a healthy society, women would be, you know, looking around at a whole bunch of men who have a bunch of money. And not necessarily a bunch of money, but a stable job. A stable job at a steel mill, or a stable job at a car shop, or a stable job at at a construction firm, or something, some other stable job that they've been working at since they were 16, ideally, maybe 18. But since they're 16, you know, they learned all they need to learn. They weren't going to be an engineer or scientist. And so because they weren't going to be an engineer or scientist, and they weren't part of a politically or well-connected or wealthy family that was going to go into politics, they had no reason to go into college. Right? I mean, the only reason you go to college is because you're going to go into politics, or you're going to be a lawyer, or you're going to be an engineer, right? That's really the only reason you need to go to college for, right? And of course, this expansion of college, what this has done is this has created a large group of people and who have unproductive, who now across the board you have all these people who are spending 4 years on an unproductive thing because they're not learning a useful skill. They're getting like history degrees or philosophy degrees or things like that, things that don't provide any real value to anyone. Okay? These don't provide value. This is not a useful skill. Okay? Go to ITT Tech, learn how to solder, circuits or whatever. Do they solder them anymore? I don't know. But learn something like that, and you'll have a useful skill. Or go to a training program and learn how to become a machinist. Useful skill. You go to college, you spend 4 years. I mean, really, dude. And moreover, like every single degree takes 4 years. Does every single degree really take the same amount of time? Like, what a coincidence that a history degree and a psychology degree just so happen to take the same amount of time to get. As I guess those two subjects are equally in depth, right? Right? No, it's stupid. It's stupid. There's no reason for all of these degrees to take precisely the same amount of time. And the fact that they do take precisely the same amount of time is evidence that these colleges are just businesses. They say, well, we want to get everyone here. We want to sucker them all in for 4 years, right? That's the program. And yeah, and they'll have some choice as to what degrees they want to get, and that'll be it. And we'll make a bunch of money off of them, and that's how we'll perpetuate our business model, right? And we'll try to make ourselves look collegial. Well, even when we build new buildings, we'll make them look academic-y, old style. Right? We'll have lots of seals, like this is the seal of the College of William and Mary, and right? We'll have all these little seals, all right? And we'll make it look like a college, right? And that's what we're selling to people, right? Because, hey, look, Harvard and Oxford have this little central area, so we'll have that too, and we'll look like Harvard and Oxford, right? Anyway, college is largely a scam, unless you're getting a real degree. But even then, like, say you want to be like a propulsion engineer or something, there's no reason why going to college is the best way to learn that. I mean, couldn't you just go to like some sort of training program for 2 years, maybe? But it's an intensive training program, and it just trains you on that subject, and you learn how to be an excellent propulsion engineer. It'd be much cheaper. You don't have to do all the college bullshit of the dormitories and the initiation and the sports teams and all the stuff. No, it's just a training program. You do that, you get out, you get done, you start going on with your life. But, people have been bamboozled into this idea of college, and it's just a money suck. It's a scam is what it is. And it's starting to come undone. For a while, it was like, well, employers would go, well, this guy, he has a philosophy degree, so you know what, we'll go ahead and hire him because he has a degree and this guy does not have a degree, so we'll hire the guy with the degree. But now I think more and more employers are starting to get wise to that. They're starting to say, well, look, every swinging dick has some humanities degree. They're not worth anything, and they're starting to have experience with these employees, and they're starting to learn that these employees, they're not any better than the guy with no college education. Moreover, in fact, they may actually be even worse because they feel kind of entitled. Like, I went to college. I already worked for 4 years, so I demand a certain amount of seniority over the guy who hasn't worked at all. No, the 22-year-old just coming in with a degree, right? No, you're actually less valuable than the 18-year-old coming in with no degree, right? Because the 18-year-old has 4 extra years that the company can get from it. See? Right? So you've actually, and in fact, if you get a degree in some anger studies, like black studies or women's studies, that's actually worse. I mean, that's worse than nothing. It's like, oh boy, so now you have a degree in women's studies, so I can expect sexual harassment lawsuits. Got it. Bye. What was I talking about? I was talking about race and something. Anyway, the United States is racially divided. I mean, these races identify the disparate impact of all policies, and they vote based on those disparate impact. This pattern is not entirely complete. You still because you have, the Hispanic approval rating for Obama is not like 90%, but it's still pretty high. Whites are still not waking up. European Americans are still kind of in this trance of America. And they don't realize that when Africans and Amerindians talk about freedom and they talk about the supporting freedom, they're talking about things like welfare. Okay, they're talking about things like income security and social security and Medicare and Medicaid and basically medical assistance for their offspring, for their own. That's what they're talking about when they speak of freedom. When they speak of freedom, they mean the Second Civil Rights Act that forces white neighborhoods to let them into their neighborhoods. That makes it illegal to have segregated neighborhoods. Now, of course, you can have de facto segregated neighborhoods. White people tend to cluster in an area, and then when blacks start showing up, hey, we want to be in here too. Whites move on. Whites move somewhere else, right? Because they can't build fences around them. They can't say no blacks, right? Because that's illegal. And so what ends up happening is blacks start moving in, so whites leave. So what do you end up getting? You end up getting all these ghettos. Yeah, it's stupid. It's stupid. It'd be much better off if people were able to build fences and be able to say no blacks. Then we won't get the ghettos. Blacks would have, oh, you don't want us here? Then we won't come here. We'll form our own neighborhoods. And we'll have employment rates higher than yours. Good. And that's another kind of a misconception, is people think that I want blacks to be poor or something. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I wish them very, very well. If anything, money is bad to a certain point, because as populations get wealthy, they start to have fewer kids. Okay? And so if black people started getting wealthier, you would expect them to have fewer kids. And the reason I think this is because as you have more money, you start to value your net worth a lot more. And having a kid is a huge hit on your net worth. Whereas if you're like super duper poor and you have a kid, you're not really spending that much money on the kid. You're breastfeeding, you're eating beans and rice, you're kind of living in the poor family lifestyle, right? Down at the bottom, and you end up not spending that much on kids. Kids end up not costing much. If your kid goes to college, maybe not, probably not. Although, the racial privilege that's called affirmative action, you may be able to get your kid to college just out of that kind of favoritism. Oh, you're a poor Hispanic. Not only as a poor Hispanic, you were able to get, grades that weren't completely awful, so we're going to let you in, And of course, it doesn't pan out, never pans out. I mean, these affirmative action students end up doing about as well as their grades, their high school grades predicted. It's not... the idea that they're somehow systematically oppressed is kind of silly. I guess you could say, well, in a poor home, it's with a bunch of kids running around, you don't have a quiet time and place to study, and that kind of presumes that they would study if they did have such a thing. Which, I mean, we've all been to high school. I'm babbling. I think everyone knows kind of the farce that this is. And of course, and that's the thing. Like I've seen like the quote unquote overachievers in my high school, and I've seen an overachiever girl from kind of a podunk poor background, and you know what she did? She went to the library and she started overachieving in the library. I mean, it's the overachiever is a type of person. It's something that it is a it's not a situational thing. It's a dispositional thing. And I know I'm not making the fundamental attribution error, because this is something that goes along over a long period of time, and it's not just a single issue. It's not just like, them holding a certain position on something based on some piece of information that they have. I'm not ascribing a dispositional thing to a specific belief. I'm describing a dispositional thing to something more general about their personality. That is their willingness to work lots and lots and lots. And, and the thing is, if you're willing to work lots and lots and lots, and you want to be class president, you want to be on the dean's list all the time and stuff like that, there's a library right there. And in fact, I've known rich kids who go to the library because it's better than their rich home, their rich palatial house, which has their family running around, right? Even though it's a lot bigger, there's still people running around, and the library's better, right? You have rich kids going to the library. In fact, I go down to the public library quite a bit. What do I see? I see lots of white people. It's like white people everywhere. It's all the white people in the library. And I look at the black people there coming in. The black people are coming in with their laptops. It's impoverished, right? So yeah, I think that the idea that the poor people lack places to study is just kind of nonsense. And they lack access to information. I mean, unless they lack access to the internet. And moreover, if your house, if you don't have the internet at your house, is that a disadvantage in terms of your academic performance, or an advantage? Really, think about it. Like, oh, they don't have access to the internet, so they don't have access to all the information. Okay, that's one thing they don't have access to. What else don't they have access to, right? So, I mean, Yeah, these are all just ex post facto reasonings for racial disparities in academic performance. Not that I somehow care about academic performance. I really don't. I think it's academic performance has, because of the political climate, become kind of seen as an end in and of itself. When it shouldn't be. It's a means to an end to know things that you should know for whatever reason. Yeah. What else was I talking about? The United States is going to have to be broken up into multiple states, and I don't know what states. At least three, and it needs to be broken up on the basis of race. Unfortunately, people are going to need to crystallize their racial identity. I mean, that's already been done amongst blacks, and so if you have amongst black people a black separatist movement start to gain steam, and where the failed state media like CNN, Fox, MSNBC start to talk about the separatist movements and talk about them seriously, I think amongst black people, I think they're basically ready to go. All the black people really need is kind of the match and the fire. They just need kind of an excuse to be racial separatists, and I think blacks are ready to go. And moreover, I think from an economic standpoint, well, it really depends. It really depends. From an economic standpoint, blacks may actually be better off. Kind of in the way, in a certain extent, they were better off under economic segregation. And the reason I say that they could be better off is because, again, they'll be forced to do things. They'll be forced to be doctors. They'll be forced to do all these things. And so you have a demand for these black people doing all these things. Whereas in a modern economy today, you have kind of this racial division, right? You have Asians doing the more mathematical thing, doing the more sciencey thing, engineering things, crowding out whites, right? They are crowding out a few whites, but especially crowding out the other races. Whereas if you have a country that's all black, then in that country, guess what? The smartest people in that country are all black. Okay. And then here's another thing for East Asians and Amerindians. In an all East Asian country, the best athletes are all East Asians, right? You can have the Japanese track and field national championships, and guess what? As an Asian person, you'll have a chance because you won't be competing with frickin' Negroes. You'll be competing with your own people. And in terms of sexual selection, East Asian males won't be competing with white males for East Asian women, right? And of course that is another thing that is not talked about very much because I think people are afraid to be impolite about it. And when they do talk about it, what do they talk about? Well, they talk about black men taking white women, which is actually a very small percentage in terms of it. And the reason they bring that up is because of race hate, is because of hatred of Europeans and just this kind of sickening, this hatred of the least racist race on the planet, who brought enlightenment to the world, who brought industry to the world, who brought liberal ideals to the world, who the only race to adopt other races of any significant number. Britain actually spent more into their empire than they ever got from their empire. Just the most humanitarian, the least racist race on the planet, right? And of course because of that, we're called the most racist. Right? That's precisely it, right? Because when you call black people racist, to their face, what do? They smack you down, right? You call a white person racist to their face, what do? They say, no, I am not. Or if they're a liberal, they say, yes, I am, but I'm trying to overcome it, right? And so who's it safe to attack? Is it safe to attack black people and say, you are a piece of shit? You are a racist piece of shit? Right? Is it safe to say that to a black person? No, it's not safe. Because then a whole bunch of blacks are going to come in and they're going to beat the shit out of you, right? And so nobody says it. That's really what this is, right? See, the problem with white people is they're not beating the shit out of people who say bad things about white people. Back when white people did that, back when white people would lynch blacks who went with white women, which I don't want to get into the lynching myth here, but back when white people did that, were white people attacked as much? No. It's only when you start being soft that you start getting attacked. When you're soft, you become demonized. Because it's not safe to demonize the people who are going to beat the shit out of you, right? It's safe to demonize the people who won't beat the shit out of you. See how this works? It's kind of like, who do you argue with? For example, do you argue with people who are going to change their mind, or do you argue with people who just yell and scream and spit at you whenever you challenge what they believe? No, you're going to argue with the people who are more reasonable, right? And as a result, you put a lot more pressure on the people who are more reasonable, whereas the people who just yell and kick and scream, you don't really deal with them, and you kind of shut them off, and that's kind of what it's been like with blacks, right? And at kind of a macro racial level. But yeah, or like Amerindians, or have a mestizo nation. You know, you can have American football and rugby in that mestizo nation, and Amerindians can actually play. You know, or you can have football, American football, in the all-white country, and you'll have a lot more, and the whole teams will be white. Whites will have a much better opportunity. Whites are still able to hack it a little bit in football nowadays. It's basically whites. It's basically blacks first and foremost. Then whites. Whites at a few positions that don't require much speed. Don't require speed. Quarterback a little bit, but the thing, even quarterback requires speed. So you're seeing a lot more black quarterbacks. But as for East Asians and Hispanics in the NFL, very few of them. And the people with Hispanic sounding names, they're all like Spanish. They're all like Caucasian Spanish people. So yeah. And so just the opening up of athletics that racially segregated athletics would be a benefit. The opening up of economic fields to Africans that Africans have kind of been shut out of at this point because they're competing against East Asians would occur. Okay, and moreover, the shutting out of sexual competition of certain race sex groups that you were not evolved to compete with, right? For example, East Asians evolved in East Asia amongst their own people, and they evolved for there to be this kind of male in this area and this kind of female in this area, and they would all mix around in their various clans and things like that, right? But they were all competing with the same racial type of people. Okay, and they didn't evolve, and whenever you have, like, for example, an East Asian male who had a giant penis, who had a 7-inch penis, wow, that was exceptional, you know. Or you had an East Asian male, wow, we have an East Asian male who's 5'10". Holy crap, this guy's a giant. He's gonna get 2 women or something, you know, assuming he can provide for and is a boss, you know. That evolved appropriately, and you had a race of females that were appropriately designed for this race of males. But now, you know, you start introducing European males into that population, and Europeans are like compared to Asian males, European males are hyper masculine, right? And so they're far more attractive than the East Asian males, to the East Asian females. Because the East Asian females, they evolved to see East Asian males as attractive, right? Those females of that race evolved to see the males of that race as attractive, okay? So, but then when you have another group of males that comes in that is far more attractive, the East Asian females are hyper attracted to the white males, or more depressingly, black males. But that screws things up. That breaks up the order. That breaks up the collective order that human groups evolved in when you start mixing them together. Okay, East Asian males didn't evolve to compete with these other races. Okay. And so they can't compete sexually, okay? And so this is cruelty to them, right? A multiracial society is cruelty to East Asian males, and it's a real awful thing, right? They need to be kept segregated into the populations that they evolved with, okay? You know, and I really feel for them, for East Asian males, I really do. And as for white males, a lot of people are saying, oh, well, you know, black males keep taking the females from the white males. If you look at the interracial marriage statistics, white females go with Hispanic males a lot more. So it's not the black males who are taking the white females. And moreover, prior to the 1965 Immigration Act, which brought in a bunch of Hispanics and East Asians and Asians of all various types, the white male... the interracial marriage between whites and blacks were basically sexually equal, right? White males went with black females about as often as black males went with white females. It is only when you started bringing in a whole bunch of Hispanic and a whole bunch of East Asian people that white males started to go to the East Asian females and the Hispanic females, okay, and not to the black females. And black females have also suffered from diversity. So that's another benefit from diversity that a lot of people don't want to talk about, but is a real serious thing that we should consider. Is what is, you know, black females and East Asian males. You know, this is horrible to them. This is cruelty to them. Okay, and it's cruelty at a very primal level. and it's just bad. And moreover, when you have these multiple races coming together in a democratic state, they're in voting wars with each other because all policies have disparate impact, and it doesn't work. And you also get less support for socialism, right? Because when you have socialism, what you want is it's people taking care of their own. But when you're not in and amongst your own, it's not really socialism in the United States what we have. No, what we have is we have race conflict. It's not black people voting for these policies because, they believe in the common good or any of that bullshit. No, it's because they want to get stuff from white people for their people. It's Amerindians wanting to get stuff for their people from my people. That's what it is. It's not like in Scandinavia you have socialism. In Norway you have socialism where people are like, yes, we are a common people, let's pool our resources. Now, this gets a little bit more complicated because ultimately I'm opposed to states. And I think states should be gotten rid of entirely. So I'm basically talking about the social racial dynamics within states and kind of thinking within the box for now. Ultimately, I want these states to all be gotten rid of, but I don't want to get into that. That's a whole another topic and a whole another complicated thing. So, okay, how long have I been going on this? A little bit over an hour. Okay, I'm done.